Hi, I'm Theo, and these broadcasts are to support the blogs on nomoreshee.com's website as well as the online classes.
In this episode, Riddles in Luke 7.
Welcome back to the No More She broadcast. And again, we want to welcome you back because we're going to return to Luke 7. And so in this episode, we want to discuss riddles in Luke 7. And we previously talked about how there was lots going on in Luke 7, and we want to dive back in as we have been requested to do so. The passage that we're going to look at narrowly today is Luke 7, verses 31 to 35. There's a parallel that's found in Matthew chapter 11, verses 16 to 19. Not much difference between these passages. In the Luke passage, the children call out to each other. In Matthew 11, the children call out to others. And there's a question here of who the children represents precisely, and which children are in participation and which are not. So the question is, are we talking about Israel? Are we talking about the audience that Jesus is speaking to? Are the children Jesus and John that do not wish to participate in the music that the Pharisees and other religious leaders and that which is coming out of the temple are trying to get people to play to? They have their feast and parties and festivals where they really are extravagant, and then they have their times of mourning, and we notice that Jesus' disciples don't fast, and so is Jesus refusing to participate, and then John is like the Essenes or those in Qumran that do not wish to participate in all the festivities at Jerusalem. So is that coming into play here? So there's questions. And also Luke, it's John the Baptist, where it's just John, and Matthew, and we notice the parallel. We have John the Baptist and Jesus, the Son of Man, language here. So Luke has added bread and wine, interestingly, and that is missing in Matthew. And what's going on there? And is bread just in relationship to food, or is there more tied to it than that? And then lastly here we have wisdom in Luke 7 will be justified by all her children, whereas wisdom will be justified by her works. So it's the offspring, it's the fruit, it's that which comes out, and we need to look into some of that. And it doesn't seem to be in this passage that wisdom is personified like it is in Proverbs 8, but later on that might play into Luke's argument when he comes back to divine wisdom. And it's a wonder if there's some little inklings here, and it's awful tempting as a Christian to want to do that when you have the incarnate God and Jesus in the conversation here. Now, many scholars have noticed there's a tie-in to Deuteronomy 21:20, but I want to grab a little bit of the context here and go back to verse 18, and it has, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they discipline him, will not listen to them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of the place where he lives. And they shall say to the elders of this city, This our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. So we have this idea of the glutton and the drunkard. And so many times, especially in the Gospel of John, we see where they want to stone Jesus. And in the biblical times, the activity, the governance, the throne or whatever is each city was at the city gate. That's where the government met, so that people from outside the city could come to that place and do their business, such as in the book of Ruth, where they meet over Ruth's future and her inheritance that's supposed to come to her and her fate. And it's done right there. The business transaction is done there at the gate. and the elders. And so, is it tying into the leadership of the Jerusalem temple, which, again, Nicholas Perrin has shown how corrupt the temple and the politics of the day and how they are intertwined so much with the Romans and the just terrible things that happened. And that background that's important to understand, and that's why a large group of people went out to the area near the Dead Sea at Qumran, possibly the Essenes there, with the community at Qumran where we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were trying to live a very aesthetic lifestyle that John embodies. And, we have this dynamic going on. And so, is Jesus the rebellious son that needs to be stoned? Of course, they're going to behead John. And so this is the question. Goes on in verse 21. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and all of Israel shall hear and fear. So is this in view inside this riddle? And again, this passage is loaded with so much, because we talked about in the previous videos, the Second Temple background to all the things that are going on, and it's quite confusing as it is, and so John is asking for clarification, and so here we have a riddle on what is going on here. So now, this idea of a glutton it's a term that's very difficult for us to understand and to translate, and we get that understanding from the Targums, and here by examples, Targum Neophiti and the other Targums also have translated that for us to the idea of a glutton and a bitter wine. That phrase was kind of hard to understand, and so we take from the Targums that it's meaning the glutton. Moving on, there's another parallel possibly in Proverbs 23, verses 20 and 21, that commands that we are not to be among drunkards, among the gluttonous eaters of meat. Is that the parallel? For the drunkard and glutton will come to poverty, slumber will clothe them with rags, and later on the king is not to be about his alcohol. That's a very dangerous thing, and Paul picks up that on several places we have in Corinthians, not being among the drunkards and following their fallacies, and then we have Ephesians 5:18 that Christians should not be drunk with the wine, the alcohol of this world, but of the Spirit they should take in and imbibe deeply. And so there's debates there that enter into various discussions along the way. Interestingly, here in the Net Bible, the version 2.0, the second edition, notes when they talk about we played the flute for you, yet you did not dance, the children of this generation were making this complaint, according to verses 33 and 34, that others were not playing the game according to the way they played the music. So they're playing a game. We have a game where we play music and do different things in different games. They're first playing a game where they're playing the game wedding game, and you're supposed to dance, and then they play the funeral music, and you're supposed to cry, and they're doing, the part of chanting out the music and the song and doing that part, and then the others are not participating is the question. And, the debates is if it's in the music of the temple, the music of the religious leaders, and Jesus and John then are not following along to their tune, just like those in Qumran decided to leave Jerusalem, and they pronounced God's curse upon Jerusalem, rightly so in some sense. And Jesus' complaint was that this generation wanted things their way and not God. So that might be a handy way of looking at things. But again, there's many different understandings of who the children are, who's participating, who's not participating, and all those. So we have in the New Interpreter's Bible, we have this idea of the point of the riddle is that those who rejected both John and Jesus could not be pleased. They were like obstinate children who would not join in any game. There's no participation. They don't want to play along. So John came preaching that aesthetic lifestyle and repentance through emptying oneself and and not partaking of the things of this world and not being a part of the Greco-Roman society and being, very, 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 very strict in his diet and his dress and his lifestyle. And they wouldn't play along with that. And Jesus comes and he offers the great joy. And the question is, what's going on here? Now, obviously, so the Pharisees also, they have their festivals of great joyous occasions that you're supposed to participate in and enjoy at the temple and fully participate. And then they have their times of fasting. And it just appears that Jesus, disciples don't fast, and John's disciples didn't participate in some of the greater festivities that they should have. And again, the Qumran community is not coming to Jerusalem. They're not participating in. So the question is, who is not participating in what? And that becomes very interesting one way or the other. So Craig Keener in his study Bible and the cultural backgrounds, and he also has a commentary on the backgrounds of the New Testament in second edition that he highly encourages because he fixed a lot of mistakes in his first edition. As far as children, they sometimes play games of weddings or funerals. The name of the game, actually, is somewhat, we could translate it as somewhat as burying a grasshopper, And I remember being a young child where friends of mine in the neighborhood knew my desire for God and my passion for ministry. And, when the neighbor's cat died, they asked me to perform the funeral service over the dead cat. So, again, they have these games. Children have these games. And so, they're not participating. And then this whole dynamic between dancing and crying. Dancing was appropriate for the celebrations of weddings and mourning for funerals, of course. Obviously, these are pretty obvious. Both were events that are community events, that is. So it's, again, participating in the community worship. This idea of the funeral processions that passed. And we just did that in Luke 7. You have this widow's son that passed. And so for example, the bystanders were often expected to join along in the procession. So when they're making this procession, and I'm reminded of when Jesus is going to Golgotha, to Calvary, and carrying his cross, and he just could not carry it anymore. And they, come by along with Simon, and the Romans grab him and make him carry it the rest of the way with Jesus. And, he had to participate, and you were kind of expected to participate whenever you came across this event, because it's a part of the community, and you should stand with the widows who have lost their loved ones, or the orphans who have lost their parents and whatnot. Here, Jesus envisions spoiled children who argue inconsistently so long as they get their own way. So that's insights from Craig Keener. Now, for some more Bible backgrounds, we have Clinton Arnold, who says, "We played the flute for you." This is chapter 7, verse 32 again, and here's a picture of an ancient flute. The children are probably playing a game of wedding, bury the grasshopper, where dancing and great celebration take place. So similar to that. And go back to chapter 5, verse 34 again. The Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BC recounts a similar proverb of abstinence and rejection. Fishes in the sea refuse to come to dry land to dance for a flute player. He then catches them in a net and scolds them for now dancing, that is, wriggling in the net as they're caught in the net, rather than when he played for them. So, and you have the same kind of dynamic going on in Aesop's fable. These are two examples from the ancient world that might be coming into play. Now, it's interesting, in the early church, there's a group of, most people are familiar with the idea that after the apostles, we have church leaders that form different ways of doing things. And the majority, we understand them as the fathers. So we call it the early church fathers. And we have the apostolic period, those who are the apostolic fathers that are the ones who come immediately after the apostles. And we have divided them further. As the church grew, we have more the Western fathers and we have the Eastern fathers. But there's another group mixed in with these called the Desert Fathers. And one of the most famous of all the Desert Fathers is St. Anthony, famous for the sense that he went out into the desert and, like Jesus, who dealt with the demons, Satan, in the temptation narrative, St. Anthony goes out in the desert and he is attacked by demons. And you have this idea in the fathers, of the desert fathers, that these are heroes. And so the heroes would go out to the desert. So let me try to explain this concept because it's very difficult for you to understand. So in the beginning, in Genesis 1, verse 2, it describes a world that's either entirely has so much water and it's flooded and, monsoon and it's terrible and nothing can be done. And chapter 1 of Genesis deals with the floodwaters and brings out the dry land, and then the earth is created and can function as it's supposed to. But then there seems to be another account that chapter 1 of Genesis verse 2 is talking about when we get to chapter 2, beginning around verse 4 and 5, where it talks about the opposite. A wilderness, a desert that has no water and is in need of watering, and how God then creates by giving water to the dry land. And so this is a concept that carries forth throughout the Bible, that creation is at the margins. And in Genesis chapter 1, the water is pushed to the margins and it's then bounded. And then in Genesis chapter 2, the wilderness, the jungle, the desert is there, and then God brings water to it, and a garden is formed. And the garden is from the word paradise, which we get from the Persian period. And the idea here is that we have taken a plot of wilderness or jungle or desert, and we have bounded it with some kind of a gate or some kind of a property. And we've chosen this specific parcel of land and we cultivate it. We, dig up everything and we give it water and we nurture it and we make a garden out of it and we grow an orchard and we grow crops and we create something that was formerly chaotic and we make order out of it and it produces life. And so we add the water. And the idea then is that's where new creation comes from. And not to be too facetious here, but today we take certain instant meals and just add water and voila! A meal in a bag or a meal in a box. Just add water and you have a meal. Just heat it up and there you go. The whole idea of the Exodus when they get out of Egypt is they have to go through the waters. The boundaries of many nations in the ancient world and even today, the boundaries of many lands, even with individual property owners, is based upon water. That my land extends to this body of water and that's where your land begins. So the water's boundaries, and we put up fences and gates and we put up boundary markers so that we can say this boundary section, and then we cultivate, we organize that land and we produce. We build a building and in that building it's an office building or a factory or whatever it is, and we through real estate we zone it properly so that it's zoned accordingly to whatever its purpose is, and then it functions in that purpose. And that's the idea of how we organize a piece of property into something. And so that's the whole thing that's going on. And so when the children of Israel are leaving the boundaries of Egypt, they find themselves again in the wilderness, akin to what is Genesis chapter 2, which requires new creation. And they come through the waters, out of the waters to get them out of Egypt, and into the waters in Joshua when they cross the Jordan. They go into the promised land, and it's again a body of water, and they're going into the new Eden, and it's the idea of new creation. And so in this time period, in the first century, when Jesus has come, and you see this in the discussions in early chapters in the book of Acts, where they talk about other false messiahs, and they're always going out just like the community, just like John is out in the wilderness, out in the desert. Then they go out into the wilderness, and it's new creation. The Messiah is going to come like Moses out of the wilderness and come in and recreate. And it's this pattern that keeps repeating itself. And even in the Greco-Roman world, this idea of heroes are those who can go out in the desert and live and thrive, because out in the desert is death. Thus, in the wilderness, you only have death. And wherever you might find a tree or some water or something like that that thrives in the desert, that is only representational where the presence of the divine has somehow interacted with the earth, with the desert. And because of that divine interaction, there is life there in that one spot, an oasis perhaps. And that's where the animals, and that's where there's water, that's where there's vegetation, and so that is represented of the divine. Otherwise, all else in the wilderness represents chaos, death, disorder. Any sign of life is a sign of the divine. All else is death. Death is outside. There's no life there. It's very chaotic. It has, animals. There's no house that you can be inside, right? There's no gates. There's no protection, no soldiers, no. People are drawn to water where they can build civilization and they can cultivate it and have culture and everything else. But out in the desert is the exact opposite. And so only the strongest can survive out in the wilderness, out in the desert. Only heroes could go out there. And so the desert fathers were known among the Romans to be some of the most powerful people, because only someone hugely powerful could be out there. And only by virtue of their participation with the divine. This idea that is talked about here, where he has a demon, where they talk about, demons. Only demons are out. That's where the demons are able to live. They're in the place of the dead. In Leviticus chapter 16, the Azazel is sent out, and sin is given back to the demons, the place of the dead, outside. That's where people with leprosy, they live outside the camp. They live in that liminal place where there's no life, and they have to stay out there until God can bring them back into the community and restore them. And so either you're very, very sick, or you're such a problem like Moses when he was kicked out of Egypt, when he killed the Egyptian and they found out about it. Capital punishment for murder. Instead, he was just kicked out, and he's allowed to live in exile because he's living outside. So as long as he's outside the community, then he can no longer harm the community. So he is excommunicated. He is kicked out, and he's turned over to Satan, as Paul would describe it in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, the person who is kicked out like the unclean lepers that are outside the camp, who are no longer exhibiting the fullness of life. They must be kicked outside. They must go outside where there's death. And so you're either very sick or you're a demon if you're out there in the desert. Or you're a hero, because only heroes could be out there. And Jesus was talking in that manner when he went out in the desert and defeated Satan. So he showed already, Luke has already shown, the gospel writers have already shown that Jesus has power over the trials and temptations of Satan. And Jesus battled the enemy just like Moses did. And Jesus was able to come back through his baptism and through the waters, just like the Jordan, cross into the land again. And he was able to then be that Messiah to bring new creation, because that's what happened repeatedly throughout the Bible, where God began with the desert in Genesis 2 and brought forth new creation, and then he had to flood everything with Noah, and then again recreation, and then again Abraham comes from outside and comes into the land, and again Moses comes from the outside and comes into the land. And so Jesus is outside and he's coming into the land, and they describe him as having a demon. And so this parallels what's said in John chapter 10, verses 20 to 21. Many of them said, he, being Jesus, has a demon and is insane. Why listen to him? So again, the idea is that, well, Jesus is just a demon. And others said, these are not the words of one who's oppressed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? And there's this grand discussion about Beelzebub and how, Jesus overthrows the strong one. And, if he is a demon himself, then how can he defeat all the other demons? And so there's a great question about that. And so they're wondering about him being demonic. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion in part 1. Come back for more when we continue and pick up this and tie everything together in part 2 of Solving the Riddles in Luke chapter 7. Thank you very much, and God bless you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes and videos to help you with your journey from nomorec.com.